Panel discussion dedicated to the issues of memory and literary imagination.
Okay. It is my very big pleasure to moderate this podium debate at the Lviv National University named after Ivan Franko. Let me introduce myself. I am Kateryna Smahliy, director of the Canon Institute Kiev office. We have a stellar panel today with four reclaimed speakers. Sitting right next to me is Ukrainian historian and public intellectual Yaroslav Hrytsak, who probably doesn't need to be introduced in this auditorium since he was a professor at the Lviv National University and now the professor of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. Sitting next to Yaroslav is Madeleine Thien. She is an acclaimed Canadian story writer and the daughter of a Malaysian Chinese immigrants. Madeleine is primarily known for her novels and short stories that deal with the diasporic histories of Asian communities in Canada. Madeleine was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, and many of her works focus on the theme of time in connection to place and human emotion. I was personally, when preparing for this podium debate, interested in one of her best novels. I think it was her second novel, which is Dogs at the Perimeter, where she talks about the genocide in Cambodia. And probably today we will have an opportunity to hear more about this remarkable piece of literature. Sitting next to Madeleine is a Polish poet, Adam Zagajewski, who was born in Lviv, but whose family was expelled from Lviv to central Poland the year when he was born, actually. He studied psychology and philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and his first poem was published in 1967. After that, Adam became a member of the New Wave literary movement, also known as the Generation 68. And the aim of this group was to stand up against the falsification of reality and the appropriation of language by communist ideology and propaganda. Immediately after this group became known, Adam was prohibited from publication in Poland and he had to immigrate to France. Later he returned to Poland and he lives there since 2002 in Krakow. And finally, Larry Siems is an American activist, is a human rights activist, journalist, and writer. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up in New Hope, Minnesota. He studied English, classical Greek at the University of Notre Dame, and he studied poetry at the Columbia University in New York. Since then, Larry has balanced writing and activism. He published scores of articles on human rights, which had featured in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The Nation, Southern Poetry Review, and other US and international publications. He has 3 books, but today we will probably touch upon his very recent books, which are titled The Torture Report, What the Documents Say About America's Post-9/11 Torture Program, and his most recent book is Guantanamo Diary, where he discusses the use of torture by the US government against terrorists and individuals who've been accused of terrorist acts against the United States. So the subject of our today's debate is memory and literary imagination as a remedy to evil. And the question which organizers ask us to discuss is, what is the connection between memory and literature? Memory is certainly one of the writer's major resources, while literary imagination is one of their main tools. Both of them are very human and therefore fragile. Both are social and therefore vulnerable. Memory can be suppressed and even erased, and we know just too many examples of that kind. Now, in the 21st century, we see the great wave of interest in national histories. How can it be explained? Why so many historical memory debates have broken out suddenly in recent years? How to explain that modern societies became so preoccupied with their history and painful memories in particular? So let me give the floor to Madeleine and ask her to reflect on these questions based on her own personal experience and the interviews that he held in Cambodia while working on her most acclaimed novel, Dogs at the Perimeter. Thank you, Madeleine.
Thank you. Thank you, Katya. It's an honor to be here. You know, I'm not sure who was sitting right here right before, but they've left their Post-it notes. And I see before me fake news, post-truth, post-fact, and then in caps, what do we do? I've spent the last 10 years living and moving and writing about Cambodia and China. So this is where I draw most of my knowledge. As some of you may know, the Cambodia War started in the late 1960s, early 1970s. A military dictator was brought to power in potentially a CIA-backed coup. Cambodia was not at war with the United States, but under Nixon and Kissinger, the United States dropped 2.5 million tons of bombs on Cambodia, a country with whom they were not at war, a neutral country. I wanted to start with that because I think it's important to say that we are not in new times. We're in an ongoing and unfolding historical moment that has precedence. It has precedence around the world, in China, Cambodia, and elsewhere. And we have a great deal to learn from what these different societies have gone through and what happened to language and thought and permissible thinking in all of these places. In Cambodia, as this war was ongoing, it was called the Sideshow to the Vietnam War. Many ordinary people flocked to the resistance. The resistance, in the end, solidified under the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. Pol Pot won the war in 1975, and as you may know, the Khmer Rouge tried to enact the fastest, purest communist revolution in human history. It would take the lives of 1/3 of the population of Cambodia, 1.7 million people, and displace every single Cambodian and create refugees for the next decade. To speak to the question, one thing that became a crime in Pol Pot's Cambodia was what was called memory sickness. And to be accused of memory sickness was to remember the world before year zero, the world before the revolution, the world before the new Cambodian identity came into being. And I would say the other thing that came into fact was the beginning of a new revolutionary language. And this is the same also in Mao's China, that the revolutionary language became a combination of the slogans and the political ideology that became permissible thinking. And to divulge from permissible thinking would reveal yourself as an enemy of the state, and in fact, in Cambodian terms, someone with memory sickness. The refugees in the aftermath of Cambodia were taken in many parts of the world, probably in many of our countries, Canada, the US, Australia, Europe, France. And this is a larger question, but the manipulation of memory was about forgetting Western involvement in the rise of the Khmer Rouge and putting forth a Western representation of itself as the place of refuge. So the sort of untrue or false descriptions of reality that were in play were always building one on top of the other, one layer over another, over another, over another. And as I was listening to the earlier panel, I was thinking about, how we were using the word lies, and I was thinking about, in fact, the conscious use of lying to create a description of reality that then becomes its own form of truth. And they are rungs. And with each rung, as you rise through these layers of mistruth, you are moving further and further away from that shared description and towards higher and higher levels of distortion. But that did not begin when Trump came to power. This is something we've been grappling with probably since the very beginning. And I'll just end because the last 5 years I've mostly been writing about China, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, and the locking together of authoritarian power and technology through surveillance and the control of sort of the platforms that people use to communicate with each other, and the loss of anonymity for Chinese citizens when they use the internet, and how all these forces are now moving together to create a very constricted world for Chinese discussions about the future. But I think it's important to keep in mind that during Mao's revolution, which lasted 27 years when Mao was in power, an estimated 60 million Chinese people lost their lives. 60 million is the low estimate. I don't think that we can forget what happened in China as we have these kinds of conversations. And I hope that our conversations about truth and post-truth don't remain sort of focused on a North American context. I think PEN's role here is to connect the kinds of conversations that are ongoing and of huge necessity in so many different parts of the world.
Thank you, Madeleine. Adam?
Good afternoon. The acoustics at such places are so that I didn't hear much from what Madeleine said. You did, I hope. But I know that she's a smart person, so she certainly said very good things. I'm in a room where probably my mother sat many times. She studied law at this university before the war, so it's like coming home for me. I went for a walk in the morning, and I went, of course, to the little street where I was born, which is for me the center of my private universe in a way. You don't need to share this feeling with me, but this is in Hrytsak, in the Piskova street. And walking slowly back towards the hotel, I saw a plaque for Joseph Roth. I think in the Chekhov Boulevard, there's a plaque saying that Joseph Roth spent some time in this house visiting his uncle. Maybe just one day, but we don't know. How long did he stay with his uncle? But it's enough to see a plaque dedicated to the memory of Joseph Roth to have the entire 20th century before you. We know he was born in Brody, not very far from here. He was bilingual or trilingual. He spoke probably Yiddish as well, German and Polish. He decided to write in German, as we know. And then he lived as an exile in Paris, in Rue de Tournon. There's another plaque in Paris, and when you walk, it's very near the Jardin du Luxembourg. It used to be a hotel where he stayed in the 30s and wrote his beautiful novels and drank a lot of alcohol, which actually killed him. So he was not a model exile, because the morals would say, why did you drink? Right? But he was a wonderful writer and one of the witnesses. And whenever you see, whenever I think of the exiles, and I think the theme of exile somehow belongs to our subject, you always see that writers are privileged. Writers are usually don't share the common fate of all the miserable exiles. They usually arrange themselves somehow. It doesn't mean that they are, it doesn't diminish in any way their importance. So, if I understand correctly, the main thing for us this afternoon is the coexistence of memory and evil. We writers refer everything to our life, right? We are not scholars. We don't have objectivity of scholar. We measure the world by our life. So I was born right after the World War II finished, in the most terrible disaster the planet has ever known. It can know now even worse disasters. We are waiting for them. And I was a baby when I went with my family. We left Lviv, or Lviv, or Lvov. We left to Silesia, from which the Germans had to leave, because there was this general transfer of population, a kind of elegant ethnic cleansing. And paradoxically, my family we found ourselves in Silesia, not far from Auschwitz. The Auschwitz was closed for a moment, but Lviv was one of the worst places of the Shoah, as you know, as any city in this part of Europe. But Lviv was not better. It was one of the most terrible places of the Holocaust. But then moving to Silesia was like moving near Auschwitz, so the choices were limited for people from this part of the world. And now, as a young person, I was slowly discovering the world of poetry, which has its own memory. We should never forget that whoever writes poetry or tries to write poems discovers a kind of memory built in the structure of poetry. The Western poetry is a kind of memory of generations of writers. We inherited the poetic forms, we inherited the sonnet, we inherited most of the existing poetic forms, which are a kind of living memory. And when you begin to write, you're blind. You're like a young cat. Cats are born blind, and poets are born blind too. We don't know what to do. We are just gesticulating, but soon for me, poetry became a kind of slightly political activity, because I understood after a while. I grew up in a totalitarian society, communist society, which was not as terrible as the Nazi world, but it was still an undemocratic, pretty cruel society. And one of my first impulses was right against this totalitarian world. And it happened so that I was not alone. There was the entire generation of poets of my age who wrote against this evil, the evil of totalitarianism. But then, once you enter poetry, you also discover beauty. You read great poets. You read, to write poetry means mostly to read. You read whatever you can find. You read also Homer. You read Baudelaire. You read John Keats, and there's beauty in poetry. So after a while, you don't know what to do with it, because you cannot use this beauty as a political weapon. You understand that beauty is independent from the social evil, from the political evil. But you still don't know what is the connection between the two. Is there any connection between the beauty and evil? And I think there's no connection. I still don't know. It's a mystery. We don't know how these things. How is it that we live in a world where there is both beauty and evil? And I think they never meet. They meet in a way when Stalin kills Mandelstam, you can say, yeah, that's the moment when evil meets beauty, but it's just a way of speaking. It's not really the event when evil touched beauty, because beauty exists in a different way. It's invisible. And certainly Mandelstam, who died out of exhaustion, was barely the same mind who created these great poems. So do I have a conclusion? Well, if I have any conclusion, is that we lived in a very strange world where the evil and the beauty don't touch. And any dream of creating literature that would diminish evil is simply vain. We cannot diminish the evil by creating beautiful poems or great novels. If we want to do this, we have to become social activists. We have to maybe to found political parties, to go in this other territory, the social territory. But no sonnet will ever diminish the evil of the world. And I think if I learn anything, is just this disconnection. For me, it's a very pessimistic conclusion, that whatever you do as a writer, and I never lost my dream of writing, my dream of being a good poet, of saying something important. But I lost my dream of changing the world when I was young. I thought, no, maybe I will change the world a little bit. When my first book appeared, I thought, this world will be totally changed now. After 2 weeks, I understood, no, the world didn't change. And so, it's not a torture to live in this disconnected world. It's difficult, it's paradoxical, but I think we should be sober, because when you're a poet, you have these moments of ecstasy. When you write, it's very hard to write without ecstatic moment. but these moments are not social moments. They don't enter the universe, but the interhuman universe. They are separate. And then when you listen to the radio news, as I do in my own country, where I strongly dislike our government, but it has nothing to do with my poems. It's a different reality. And I still try to understand how do they coexist. Thank you.
What is the role of writers and civic activists in addressing the evil?
You're asking me? Or?
No, Larry, who sits next to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here speaking with all of you today. So what is the role of writers and what can writers do? I guess I have a challenge to answer from Adam here. So I'm from America, and we're talking about memory, and it's not always the best source of information about memory to talk to an American, because my country does memory very badly. You would think that in a thoughtful country where things get recorded into memory, and memory works the way you would hope memory works, these things would not be repeated. These were enormous achievements of social movements. And yet, in my lifetime, we've gone from Vietnam and segregation to the catastrophe of the Iraq invasion and the rise of white nationalism in the United States. So I think we have a problem with how we record our experience and how we learn from our experience. I thought I'd talk today about a specific example of the struggle for memory that's happening right now in the United States. Could you do the first slide? So let's start with a proposition, I suppose. You can't remember what you don't see or you don't experience. When we talk about the literature of memory, what you're talking about is trying to convey an experience through the generations. You're usually talking about the past to the present so that people can read it and feel an experience that they don't have. This is a document that was created by the CIA's Inspector General, the own investigator, the internal investigator in the CIA in 2003. This is the form that it was released to the public in 2009, 5 years after it had been written. It has 3 words that we can read. It says enhanced interrogation techniques at the top, and then it says the waterboard technique. That's what it says. We know what waterboarding is, right? When you simulate drowning somebody. So, I mean, let's start with that. Behind that blackness there is a whole story of some places, secret CIA prisons, one of which was in Poland, about almost exactly 500 miles away from here, just about 2 hours north of Warsaw. And in that prison, 2 men were waterboarded repeatedly over the course of several months. Now, waterboarding is not a technique. Waterboarding is an extremely harrowing and intimate human interaction between human beings. There are human torturers and human tortured. And you get no sense of humanity when you look at this document. You get no sense of a human story. So one of the great challenges, I think, for activists and writers and journalists in the United States between, say, 2005 and 2010 or 11 was to try to tear down that black space and try to find the human lives behind it. And so I was part of a group of writers, journalists, human rights activists who did a lot of work between 2009 and 2012 to get government documents declassified that told the stories. But the stories that they told were largely of the Americans who were doing these things. Those documents were fascinating because the stories that they told were often more complex than you would expect. Many of the documents exist because many men and women who were in those rooms doing the waterboarding were absolutely sickened by that. And so they came home, and they came home to the CIA headquarters in Langley, and they complained, and so the CIA Inspector General started an investigation, and that's why we have these documents. So there's a whole story of kind of internal human response to the evil that was being perpetuated that we haven't been able to see. But what we really couldn't see until very recently was the stories of the men who were tortured. And that was because dehumanization was it's an essential element of torture, and it's an essential consequence of torture. So you have invisible people in secret spaces, completely dehumanized. We don't know who they are. We say that torture is a crime. It's one of the highest crimes in international human rights law because it's a violation of the individual's humanity. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. But you can't see the people, and they were presented as the worst of the worst, that they were particularly monstrous people. These places were secret in order to torture because torture is absolutely illegal under US and international law, so it had to happen in secret. And then once it happened, it had to be kept secret because otherwise people would be prosecuted for it. So secrecy has been an instrumental part of this. And the voices, as I say, that were most suppressed were the voices of the men who were tortured. We did not know until 2006 the names. We did not know the names of the 760 men who were held in Guantanamo Bay until 2006, 4 years after it opened. We didn't hear their voices till that year when they released transcripts of some of the hearings that they had in Guantanamo. One of those transcripts was of a hearing of a guy named Mohamedou Ould Slahi. He was from Mauritania. And during his hearing, he starts to tell the story of how he was tortured. As he's telling the story, the recording machine malfunctions. So we lose a whole chunk of his story about what happened. But when it comes back on, he says, you know, I just finished a whole book about this. I just wrote a whole book about this, and they sent it to Washington. You should get it, and there's like a locked facility in Washington, D.C. where they keep all of the materials that Guantanamo prisoners created. He said, you should get it back and you should read it. He said, it's a really interesting book, I think. You know, and he's joking and kind of plugging his work of art. So he wrote that in 2005. Next slide. Finally, in 2012, his lawyers were able to give me this manuscript that he wrote in 2005 by hand in his prison cell by himself, months after he had gone through one of the worst tortures that was meted out by the United States after 9/11. And here's a couple pages from his handwritten manuscript, and you can see how it was presented to the public. That is, the government censored significant amounts of it. I worked with this man. I didn't work with him. That was a complete and utter falsehood. I couldn't work with him because no writer or journalist has ever been allowed to speak with a Guantanamo prisoner. No journalist has ever interviewed a Guantanamo prisoner while they're there. So I had to edit this manuscript without having any communication with him. Now, this guy was released from Guantanamo last October, partly because this book, when it was published in October 2015, was sold in countries around the world and people read it. And the United States, which was clearly keeping him a prisoner in order that he not be able to tell the shameful story of what the United States had done to him, could no longer have that excuse for keeping him, and so they released him in October of last year. He should be here today and not me, honestly. The reason he's not here today is because the United States government has not restored his passport. So he's home in Nouakchott, Mauritania, and that's just a continuation of this effort to keep him from meeting people. But if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a couple more minutes than probably my allotted time, because I want you to meet him and I want him to be able to speak with you. This is about a 5 to 6 minute video that Mohamedou shot for me, in which he will say hello and then read a little passage. We worked together over the last 6 months to do what he called a repaired edition of the Guantanamo Diary, which is essentially to fill in the black spaces. Of course, this is in his memory, right? The US government will never release the censored manuscript, but he knows the scenes that are there. And so we've worked together. That's going to be published next month, and so there's just a little clip of him reading a bit of it.
Hi, my name is Smahliy. I'm truly honored to be invited to the 83rd Penn International Congress in the great city of Lviv in the Ukraine. Thank you very much, Penn International, and thank you, the great city of Lviv in the Ukraine. As many of you already know, I'm the author of the book Guantanamo Diary. This is what it looked like. A great deal of censorship, and this book was a series of letters that I sent to my lawyers in the United States, and it took many years for us to publish it because the government opposed at every step of the way. And in the end, they decided to give us a damaged property. They gave us a manuscript that was heavily redacted. 10 months ago, I was released, and I set out with my good friend Larry to repair. And we repaired everything. Actually, the reparation has to fall completely on my own back. You only have to. Because it was my memory that was called upon to recall the events. And I started very small, like this, just writing names, places, dates. But when I got to the very big portion, like this, it was really very challenging to organize the thought and to recall the details. Today, I'm going to read you this portion. Of course, there is nothing to read here, but I prepared this, I pulled out this from the new edition that, by the way, is due next month, and I would like to share with you the unredacted version of this morning. The doorbell rang, and Staff Sergeant Mary searched through with the polygraph tester. He was a small white man in his early 40s, with hair that was sprinkled gray, the perfect candidate for a DOD contract. My name is John Smith. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, I said, shaking his hand. I know he was dishonest about his name. He unluckily chose the wrong name, John Smith, which I know to be a generic name, but I really didn't care. After all, what interrogated is honest about anything. He could as well have introduced himself as Joe Dirt, with the same effect. You will be working with me today. How are you? I'm very nervous, I answered. Perfect, that is the way you should be. I don't like relaxed detainees. Give me a minute. I'm going to install the equipment. In fact, Staff Sergeant Mary and I helped him in setting up his equipment. He was complaining that the building wasn't steady enough, and he was worried about the vibrations, and it took a long time for him to decide where to set up the machine. We ended up in a corner outside my cell. A firm plastic chair was placed next to the table, and I was told to sit facing the thick white wooden wall. So close, it almost kissed my nose. Now I wanted to sit and look at me the whole time while I'm speaking to you. Have you taken any polygraph tests before? Yes, I have. So you understand the process and how this works. I guess I do. But John started a long explanation. Anyway, I noticed an ant walking up the wall and then many more leading and following. I learned to follow ants in Mauritanian secret prison, watching them until they left the cell and me behind. I watched this one climb, going about our daily business and not realizing the drama that was unfolding before her very eyes. I drowned myself in her world, and I missed a lot of what the tester was saying. I was so nervous, but I took this as the first good omen of the morning. I was wondering if I should just concentrate on the end and answer the question without thinking. Are you wearing shoes? Is your name Muhammad? Are you sitting on a chair? Are you an astronaut? Have you ever cheated on a test? I answered yes. I remember the time that I was frustrated with a teacher in this subject and decided to attend exactly 0 classes. I ended up having to study the subject in a hurry, and I brought his textbook with me to the test for when I couldn't answer a question on my own. John took some time to scold me. He told me that he never cheated in his life, and that he hated people who cheat to get where they don't deserve. I tried to explain that in most subjects at the university we were allowed to look things up during tests, because that is what we would do in real life. But some teachers denied that opportunity. But no amount of whitewashing myself would make him have sympathy with me or give me a break. Staff Sergeant Mary was looking at me and smiling. She told me later on that she had cheated in college too. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So the passage that Mohammed read, as you saw, was a polygraph exam that he was given, and the question is, why was it censored? He passed the polygraph exam. We know that's because we now have the court papers that describe the test exactly as he describes it in terms of the questions and answers. And so we knew in 2005 that he was not who we thought he was. We kept him for another 10 years. But there's another reason why that passage, I think, was censored and why the whole book was censored, and that's because in the middle of this most inhumane, dehumanizing world, there are these incredible moments of human recognition and contact. The woman Mary in this scene is a sergeant who was an interrogator who at one point earlier is called to sexually molest him, as we did to many of the men who were in Guantanamo. And here they've begun a process of repairing their relationship that culminates in this moment in which they have this moment of recognition that all students everywhere who are actually, like us, cheat on tests. So we're talking about literary imagination as a remedy to evil. Mohammed has found a remedy to evil by writing this book, the process that he went through in refusing to dehumanize his captors the way he was dehumanized and presenting them all as individual human beings. And then when he got out, publicly saying that he has forgiven everyone, that he's not going to seek reparations, and then finally in repairing the book. What hasn't happened is that we haven't repaired ourselves. And so the challenge remains, when we're talking about memory, how to move his experience into the American memory. And that's the one that, like I say, my country has a great deal of difficulty with. There are still men in Guantanamo whose stories are not heard. There are probably manuscripts in Guantanamo that we haven't seen. And so the work of the writers and the journalists continues, and the editors and the publishers should continue to be to bring these voices into the conversation and make them human before a public, because what happens if you don't is you end up in a political situation where you have a president of the United States who's imposing a travel ban on all Muslims from certain countries, and you have an enormous rise of Islamophobia around the country because people do not recognize their own brothers and sisters from around the world. And so that's the challenge, and that's what literature does. Thank you.
But I feel rather awed here because I am not writer, even though I wish to be. And secondly, I got at a very short notice, the very final moment, I have to replace this honorable to be in this honorable audience. But I believe there is something common for writers and historians, that both of us are producing texts. And text has something to do with reality. And the reality has to do something with knowledge, so to say, of the world. If I may start with telling something, even though I'm a historian, I don't like the past. I believe that past is not another country, it's a very dangerous country. And the best we could do is overcome the past. Even more that I dislike past, I dislike historical memory. Because I believe historical memory, the way we believe as a kind of collective memory, is one of the most caustic material that is produced by the chemistry of our mind. This is not mine words, I'm quoting somebody who I don't really remember, because what is the problem here? The problem here is that historical memory refers mostly collective memory. And if I may so, we couldn't learn the truth collectively. All the breakthrough in terms of discoveries, they're only personal, individual. There is no Copernicuses or Einsteins. There is one Copernicus or one Einstein, that's all of us. Or put it differently, we are able to learn truth individually, and we err collectively. So each time our individual past or memory is transformed in collective memory, we are really in danger. Another historian, Ernst Renan, put it very nicely that historical memory is not about remembrance, it's about forgetting, it's about selection, it's about tabooing some of the elements which doesn't fit in our collective image. So this is basically the reason which I dislike historical memory and abstain to it. Saying that, I believe it's especially true in talking about this region. Madeleine told about the Cambodia and China, which I believe the region of, if I may describe it, region society of extreme violence for a while. I believe there are many societies of this kind, and this is the one, especially in the period between the beginning of the first and until the end of the Second World War. I'll probably give you another example. In a relatively short span of time, since 1932 to 1947, actually 15 years, this society in general has survived, experienced 5 waves of genocides, starting from Ukrainian famine, then with the destruction of the Soviet prisoner of war, then Holocaust, then deportation Crimean, then Volhynia, Polish massacre of Poles by Ukrainian nationalists, then deportation Crimean Tatars, there were 6 actually, and then deportation Ukrainians from the Polish side of the border from their homeland. So imagine for the 15th time, short span, 15 years, and 6 genocidal waves, one after another. You could just guess to what kind of traumatic experience the people here have, and how could they cope with this historical experience. There are basically 2 ways to deal with this traumatic experience. The first one was the Soviet one, and it was rather efficient, amnesia. None of these genocides were allowed to be ever articulated. Neither famine nor even Holocaust. Holocaust has also come very much silenced here. It was not existent. And actually, as a citizen of the Soviet Union, I grew up in the country which doesn't have this, I didn't have this kind of memory, and I was rather happy. I was a lucky child until I got to some 20s. I started to realize what really the story of this territory is. But basically it was amnesia, but it didn't work until if this would work, if Soviet Union would, say, exist forever, it probably would like a remedy. But then with the collapse of Soviet Union, we have a kind of another way to deal with this trauma, and this is a very peculiar way, or rather universal, I would say, because what we say, each country produces its own narrative of the, say, victimhood. In a sense, they select their own victims, and they tend to forget about the other victims. So Jews are talking about the Holocaust, Poles are talking about Volhynia, Ukraine is talking about a famine, and it seems like the different territories, not the same country. Moreover, this city has extremely traumatic history. Just give you one example. In span time of 2 weeks, between the end of June 41 until beginning of the July 41, there were several of extreme violence, with shooting of the Soviet prisoners, then the large pogroms, and then another shooting of which mostly was, not mostly exclusively, but for Ukrainians, then anti-Jewish pogrom, and then shooting of the Polish professors. And if you read the histories of these victims, of these stories, they're three different stories. They never come together. It's like impressions, there's not about the same city, like three different cities, so to say. And this is, I believe, this is something which is tragedy, because this is exactly what collective memory does, because it privileges its own victims, so to say. To make the story even more complicated, sometimes you could hardly find a kind of distinction, division between the victims and perpetrators. Because today victims sometimes were yesterday perpetrators. And how could you distill them? So any kind of the categorization of the victims provides a very kind, say, sense of tabooing and selection, and this making this kind of collective memory, which makes me very uneasy. And I believe it's exactly what happened nowadays, because nowadays we have been increasing this kind of privileging. Poland probably is the closest case nowadays, because I don't know what the following is going on in Poland, but 2 days ago they have a kind of by the common applause, they accepted, or say they insert in collective memory the memory about the army, which was very xenophobic, first of all, excluding anti-Jewish, and also has a track collaboration with the Gestapo. But since they were Polish, they are now heroes in this nowadays era. This is the same story everywhere. We could talk the same story about here in Ukraine, the same story about Upal, kind of things. I don't know what to do with this. I know how to deal with this. And I believe there is no way to deal with this efficiently, collectively, so to say. My simplest response is that what I learned from Albert Camus, that victims has no nationality. They're just victims. So you want to tell the story, the truth of the story, you have to take a position of the victim, whoever those victims are. Probably it sounds too pathetic, but sometimes this kind of the statement sounds very pathetic, and therefore we have no choice but to repeat it, because if we are not. So, and secondly, we have to deal with some kind of, say, universal victims. Those are always the victim regardless of the situation. And I would say this, in the Second World War, this was Jews. Nowadays, they're becoming increasingly refugees. We have this problem in Europe, and we have this problem in Ukraine. So actually, we could really define or categorize writers, say, according to these criteria, what they're writing about those two categories and what they stand for. Especially now in Ukraine, we have people who are both describing this kind of tragedy on victims and Jews and the refugees. So those are, say, like we have a lot of the refugees here from Donbass coming to this region, and there are some writers, provide this name, say, we have enough of them. They're just refugees. So this is the story. I don't believe we could really beat it, because I believe what I believe is confirm or would like to consent. Second, Madeleine, that this is not new stories. This is not new times. This is still the old times. Just what the perception may be changed, but still we are very much there. And I believe evil is there, and you could not really beat it, so to say, because it's something which is inherent. Again, banality probably, but what is not banality, I believe, that even so we are doomed to not probably defeat, but something that we could not really find a remedy to this evil. The only and the honest way to do is still beat it, because it's exactly what makes us good writers, historians, and also very good human beings. Thank you.
Thank you.